The sound of metal slamming shut echoed through the hallway, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. The heavy door behind him locked, sealing off the world he once knew. Everything felt unreal. Just a few weeks ago, he was walking freely down city streets, laughing with friends, chasing small dreams. Now the air smelled of bleach and steel, and every step was watched by someone with a uniform and cold eyes. He didn't try to speak. His throat was dry and his chest felt heavy. The guard pointed him toward a small cell with a thin mattress and a single metal sink. When the door closed again, the sound was louder than anything he had ever heard. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling. His mind kept replaying the moment that brought him here, the one mistake that changed everything. It wasn't supposed to go this far. He had made a poor choice, something he thought would pass without real consequences. But life doesn't always give warnings before it teaches lessons. In one night, everything fell apart. The trust of his family, the dreams he had for his future, even the little respect he had for himself, all gone in a blink. The first night inside was the hardest. The noises never stopped. Distant voices arguing, footsteps echoing through the halls, someone crying quietly in another cell. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, realizing that this was his new reality. He couldn't call anyone, couldn't leave, couldn't undo anything. Guilt burned through him like fire. For the first time in his life, he felt completely powerless. Morning came early, with the sound of keys jangling and orders shouted through the bars. He followed others to the cafeteria, keeping his head low. Everyone looked different here. Some faces tired, some cold, others blank. He noticed that people didn't talk much. Most moved with a quiet rhythm, like they had accepted that this was their life now. He wasn't ready to accept it. Not yet. Back in his cell, he found a piece of paper and started writing. He didn't know what to say, but he wrote anyway. A letter to his mother. He apologized over and over, though he knew words couldn't fix the pain he caused. He ended it with a promise he wasn't even sure he could keep, that he would become a better man. Days turned into weeks, and he started learning how time worked inside. It didn't move fast or slow, it just lingered like a heavy fog. Every day felt the same. Breakfast, chores, waiting, lights out. He counted the marks on the wall, watched dust float in the air, and listened to the quiet moments between noise. Sometimes, when the hallway was still, he thought about the people he hurt. He thought about how different things might have been if he had just walked away that day. There were people inside who seemed to have stopped caring altogether. They laughed at rules, cursed at the guards, and talked about their lives like none of it mattered. But there were also a few who carried something different in their eyes, a quiet strength, a kind of peace he didn't understand. One older man across the hall noticed him one afternoon and said, "You don't have to let this place change who you are. You can change yourself instead." He didn't answer, but those words stayed with him. At first, he thought about giving up. Some days he felt too heavy to move, but other days he found small reasons to keep going. A kind gesture, a letter from home, a memory of laughter. He started to realize that maybe this time, as painful as it was, could be the beginning of something new. One morning, a guard brought him to a small room where a volunteer talked about choices and second chances. He didn't think much of it at first, but listening to her stories about people who turned their lives around made him think. Maybe it wasn't too late for him either. That night he wrote again to his mother, not to apologize this time, but to tell her that he was trying. The days that followed were quieter. He began reading from the small shelf near the dining area. Books about life, change, and forgiveness. He didn't understand everything he read, but he liked how it made him feel, like the world was still bigger than these walls. Sometimes he caught himself smiling at memories of home, the smell of food cooking, the sound of his mother's voice calling him to dinner. He missed those moments more than anything. Inside, you learn to see people differently. The man who always sat alone wasn't cold. He just missed his daughter. The loud one who joked all the time wasn't happy. He was hiding his pain. Everyone had a story, and most of them started with one bad choice. It made him realize how fragile life really was, how one moment could rewrite your entire path. At night, when the lights dimmed, he lay awake thinking about the world outside. He imagined his mother watering plants in the yard, his younger brother going to school, life moving on without him. The thought hurt, but it also gave him strength. He wanted to be part of that world again, not as the person who failed them, but as someone who made things right. One evening, while sweeping the hallway, He overheard two men talking about faith and forgiveness. One said, "You can't change the past, but you can decide who you are today." That simple line hit him hard. He realized that he had been carrying guilt like a chain, but maybe forgiveness started with himself. Maybe he needed to let go of the hate he felt toward the person he used to be. Slowly, the fear that once filled him began to fade. He started helping new arrivals find their way, telling them which guards to talk to and how to stay out of trouble. It wasn't much, but it gave him purpose. He no longer saw himself as a victim of his mistakes. He was someone rebuilding piece by piece. There were still hard days. Some mornings the weight of the walls felt unbearable, but even then he reminded himself why he was still fighting. Every time he looked at the folded letters from his mother, he felt a quiet push forward. Her words gave him hope, and hope was something rare in a place like this. Months passed. He stopped counting days. Instead, he counted small victories. A book finished, a kind word shared, a promise kept. For the first time in a long while, he felt like a person again, not just a number in a system. The guards noticed too. One of them, who rarely spoke, nodded at him one day and said, "You're doing good. Keep it that way." It was a small thing, but it meant more than he could say. That night, lying on his thin mattress, he realized something he hadn't before. The walls around him were still there, but inside he was beginning to feel free, not because of where he was, but because of who he was becoming. For the first time since walking through those heavy metal doors, he believed that maybe this place could be the start of his second chance. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. The old version of himself was gone. The mistakes, the anger, the careless choices, they had shaped him, but they didn't have to define him. Behind those bars, something inside him had begun to change. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and real. And even though freedom was still far away, he could feel it growing within him. One small act, one honest thought, one new day at a time. The morning started like every other day inside, but something about it felt different. Maybe it was the way the sun slipped through the narrow window. Or maybe it was because he had finally slept without waking up from a bad dream. He sat on his bunk, watching the light move slowly across the floor. The air was cool, and for a moment he almost forgot where he was. But the sound of metal doors clanging quickly reminded him that this wasn't freedom. It was still the same place filled with echoes and rules. He had been there long enough now to know how things worked. Everyone followed a rhythm, a pattern that never really changed. You woke up, lined up, ate, worked, and went back to your cell. But even within that dull routine, people found ways to survive. Some told stories to make the hours pass. Others buried themselves in books or workouts. For him, it was thinking. He thought a lot about what he had done, what he wanted to fix, and how to start over when the world outside might never forget. He noticed small things now, things he used to ignore before all this. The kindness in the way one man shared his bread with another, the quiet nods people exchanged instead of words, the moments when laughter broke through the silence, even in a place that wasn't meant for joy. These details made him realize that not everything inside was dark. There were still pieces of light, small, hidden, but real. One afternoon he was assigned to help in the library. It was a simple job, organizing books, wiping the shelves, keeping count of returns, but it quickly became something more. The library wasn't big, but it felt different from the rest of the place. It was quiet, calm, and full of stories that didn't belong to bars or walls. He ran his fingers along the covers, reading titles he had never heard before. The librarian, an older man who had been inside for many years, noticed his curiosity and said softly, "Books can take you far from here, even when your body can't move." He smiled, not sure how to reply, but he understood what the man meant. That day, he borrowed a book about life after struggle. He read it slowly, sometimes reading the same page twice just to feel the words sink in. It wasn't just a story. It felt like a mirror. It talked about regret, forgiveness, and change, the same things that filled his mind every night. As days passed, the library became his favorite place. It wasn't only about the books. It was about the silence that allowed him to think clearly. He began helping others who came in, suggesting what to read or simply listening when they wanted to talk. He realized that people inside carried heavy stories, some full of pain, others full of hope. They weren't all bad people. Many were just broken in ways the world never tried to understand. One day, while returning books, he met a man who couldn't read well. The man asked if he could help him understand a few pages. At first he hesitated, unsure if he was the right person for that. But then he remembered how lost he had felt when he first came here, and how a few kind words had made a difference. So he sat down and began reading out loud, explaining the meaning of the words. They continued doing it every evening for a week, and soon a few others joined. Before long, a small group started gathering around him during free time. They read, talked, and shared thoughts about what the stories meant. For the first time since he came inside, he felt useful. That feeling gave him a new kind of strength. It wasn't physical, it was something deeper. He realized that helping others helped him too. It reminded him that he still had value, even in a place that was designed to strip people of it. He was changing, not just for himself, but for the people who believed he still could. Weeks went by and the seasons changed outside the narrow window. He noticed the air getting cooler, the light softer. Time was moving, and so was he. The guards began to notice his calm behavior. He didn't get into trouble. He followed the rules quietly. One afternoon, one of the officers asked if he wanted to join a workshop that taught skills and helped people prepare for life after release. He agreed without thinking twice. The workshop was held in a small room with a few chairs and old computers. The instructor, a volunteer from outside, spoke about patience, responsibility, and finding purpose. He listened carefully, taking notes even when he didn't understand everything. When the instructor asked what each person wanted to do after release, some said they didn't know. Others shrugged. When it was his turn, he stayed silent for a moment, then said softly, "I want to help people not make the same mistakes I did." The instructor smiled and said, "Then you've already started changing." That night, he couldn't stop thinking about those words. Maybe change wasn't about waiting for the right moment. It was about deciding to start now, even when life still felt uncertain. He looked around his small cell and realized it didn't look so cold anymore. It was still small, still gray, but it didn't scare him like before. It had become a place where he was learning who he really was. Some evenings he'd sit near the window listening to the faint sounds from outside. Sometimes he could hear rain. Other times just the wind. He'd close his eyes and imagine home, the smell of fresh food, the laughter of neighbors, the streetlights flickering. Those memories kept him going. They reminded him that there was still life waiting beyond these walls, and that he needed to be ready for it. One day, during a group meeting, a counselor asked everyone to talk about what they regretted most. The room went quiet. Some spoke easily, others struggled to find words. When it was his turn, his voice cracked a little. "I regret not listening," he said. "I regret thinking I had all the time in the world to fix things. I lost so much because I didn't stop to think." There was silence for a moment, then the counselor nodded and said, "Regret means you've started to care again. That's where healing begins." Those words stayed with him long after the meeting ended. He started writing again, but this time his letters were different. He didn't just apologize anymore. He shared what he was learning, how he was changing, how he was trying. His mother's replies became warmer, filled with hope instead of sadness. She told him she was proud that he was trying, and that was all he needed to hear. Each letter was like a light in the darkness, guiding him towards something better. There were still bad days, of course. Days when frustration took over, when someone's words cut deep, or when the memories of what he had done felt too heavy to carry. But now he knew how to breathe through it. He had learned to pause, to think before reacting. The anger that once controlled him was fading, replaced by something gentler, understanding. Months later, he was asked to speak to new arrivals during an orientation session. He stood in front of them, nervous but steady. "You can't change the past," he told them, "but you can decide what kind of person you want to be from this moment on." As he spoke, he saw in their faces the same fear and confusion he once had. It made him realize how far he had come. That night he sat by the window again, the same one that once felt like a reminder of everything he lost. Now it felt different. The small patch of sky beyond the bars didn't look like a trap anymore. It looked like a promise. A quiet whisper that one day, things could be better if he kept trying. He didn't know how long it would take or what waited for him beyond those gates. But one thing was certain: the person who walked in was gone. In his place stood someone who was learning to live again, one small step at a time, behind walls that could no longer hold his spirit. It was a quiet afternoon when he received the letter that would change everything. He had been helping out in the library, arranging books like always when one of the guards called his name. The guard handed him a white envelope and walked away without saying much. His hands trembled a little as he looked at it. The writing on the front was familiar. It was his mother's. He sat on the edge of his bed and opened it carefully like it was something fragile. The first line hit him like a wave. She wrote about how much she missed him, how the house felt empty without his voice, and how she prayed every day for him to find peace inside. But there was something else in her words this time. She wasn't just sad. She was hopeful. She wrote that she still believed he could turn his life around. She said she forgave him, but more importantly, she wanted him to forgive himself. He read the letter again and again. By the time he finished, his eyes were wet and his chest felt heavy in a different way, not from guilt but from love. That night he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about his mother's words, about how she still saw something good in him when he could barely see it himself. He realized that even though he was locked away, there were still people out there waiting for him to come back, not just come back home, but come back as a better man. The next morning, he looked at himself in the small mirror above the sink. For a long time, he hadn't really looked. He saw the tired eyes, the rough hands, the marks of time. But behind all that, he saw something else, determination. That day, he promised himself that he wouldn't waste another day feeling sorry. He would start doing something that mattered. He began spending more time helping others who struggled to read and write. Some of them were younger, others older, but all of them were just trying to get through each day. He remembered how lost he had felt when he first came in, so he listened to them, helped them sound out words, and told them they could do better. Slowly, more people started joining their small group in the evenings. They called it study time, but really it was a place where they could talk about life too. One of the men said, "You got a gift for this, you know? Not everyone can sit here and listen like you do." He didn't know how to respond, so he just smiled. But deep down it felt good to be seen that way, for something positive. The prison staff noticed the change as well. One of the counselors stopped him after a session and said, "I've been seeing your effort. Keep it up, it's not easy to grow in a place like this." Those words stayed with him. For the first time, he wasn't being judged by his past, but by the choices he was making now. One evening, while cleaning up the library, he found an old notebook that someone had left behind. The pages were half empty, but the first few lines were written by another inmate years ago. It said, "Every person has two choices, to stay broken or to rebuild. Both hurt, but only one heals." He stared at those words for a long time. That night he started writing again. Not letters this time, just thoughts. He wrote about what he was learning, about forgiveness, about how time could be both a punishment and a teacher. The notebook became his quiet space. Whenever he felt angry or lost, he wrote. Sometimes the words didn't make sense, but it didn't matter. Writing helped him breathe. He even began sharing some of his thoughts with others, reading short lines out loud during group sessions. Some laughed, some nodded, but many said they understood exactly what he meant. As the months passed, he started to notice something different about himself. He wasn't counting the days anymore. He was living them. The walls didn't feel as suffocating, and the silence didn't feel as cold. He had found purpose in small things. Helping someone spell a word, listening to a story, or giving advice when someone was on the edge of giving up. One day, a new inmate joined their group. He was quiet, angry, and full of resentment. He reminded him of himself when he first arrived, lost and bitter. He sat beside the man and asked if he wanted to join the reading sessions. The man shrugged and said, "What's the point? None of this changes anything." He smiled gently and said, "Maybe not everything, but it changes you, and that's where it starts." The man didn't answer that day, but the next week he showed up. That small moment reminded him that change spreads quietly, like ripples in water. One act of kindness could go further than you ever expect. He thought of his mother again, how her one letter had started his own change. Maybe this was how it worked. One heart helping another even in the darkest places. The seasons turned again and winter came. The cold air crept through the cracks and everyone moved slower, quieter. But he didn't mind. He found warmth in the small things, conversations, laughter, letters from home. Every time he received one, he would share a few lines with the group. They'd smile and say, "Your mom sounds strong." And she was. Her words were his reminder to keep going. He started working in the workshop next to the library. It was hard work, fixing old chairs, repairing shelves, but it gave him something to do with his hands. The sound of tools, the smell of wood, the sense of creating something useful, it all made him feel alive again. The instructor told him he had a good eye for detail. He didn't say it out loud, but he felt proud. For years he thought he wasn't good at anything. Now he was starting to believe otherwise. One afternoon, as he was fixing a broken stool, the counselor stopped by again. "You ever think about what you'll do when you leave here?" she asked. He paused for a moment, then said, "I just want to help people the way others helped me." She smiled and said, "Then start now. Don't wait for the gates to open." That simple line became another turning point for him. From that day, he tried to be someone others could count on. If someone was having a rough day, he'd listen. If there was a fight brewing, he'd try to calm it down. Not by force, but by words. He learned that peace wasn't about being silent. It was about choosing to stay calm when everything around you wasn't. Months later, he received another letter from his mother. This one was different. She wrote about how proud she was of the man he was becoming. She said neighbors had asked about him, and she told them, "My son is learning who he truly is." That line brought tears to his eyes. For years he thought he had let everyone down, but now he was starting to make things right, not by talking, but by living differently. He folded the letter and placed it in his notebook with the others. Each letter was a piece of his journey, a reminder of how far he'd come. He wasn't free yet, not in the way most people think of freedom, but inside, something had shifted. The anger that once ruled his heart was gone, replaced by something steady and calm. One evening, as he walked back to his cell, he looked around the hallway. The same walls, the same doors, the same faces, but he saw them differently now. He realized that even in a place built to break people, it was still possible to rebuild. You just had to want it bad enough before sleeping. He opened his notebook one last time that night and wrote a single line. "Change doesn't start when the gates open. It starts when you do." Then he closed it gently, placed it under his pillow, and drifted off to sleep with a small smile, knowing he was finally becoming the person his mother always believed he could be. The morning began like any other. The same whistle, the same echo of boots down the corridor, the same dull light creeping through the small window. But there was a strange tension in the air that day, something heavy that no one could quite explain. People were quieter than usual during breakfast, their eyes moving quickly, their words short and low. He felt it too, a strange pull like the day was holding its breath. After breakfast, he went to his usual work shift in the workshop. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air, blending with the faint hum of a radio somewhere in the corner. He focused on fixing a loose chair leg, his hands steady, his mind calm. He liked working with wood. It gave him peace, made him feel human again. But even there, he could sense the unease. People seemed distracted, glancing at the clock, whispering to each other when the guards weren't looking. Later that morning, as he walked through the corridor toward the library, voices began to rise near one of the cell blocks. At first it sounded like a regular argument, those happened often, but then it grew louder, sharper, more dangerous. He froze when he heard the sound of metal clattering to the floor. For a second the air felt thick and still. The guards shouted, footsteps ran, and chaos spread like wildfire. He stood there, heart pounding, unsure of what to do. Every instinct told him to step back, to stay away, to protect himself. But then he saw two men struggling in the middle of the hallway, anger written across their faces. Others backed away, afraid to get involved. Something inside him moved, an old fear mixed with something new, something stronger. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Stop," he shouted, his voice shaking but firm. The men didn't listen at first. One pushed the other, shouting back. He stepped closer, putting himself between them. "This isn't worth it," he said again, louder this time. For a moment everything seemed frozen. The noise, the movement, even time itself. One of the guards rushed in, pulling them apart. No one got hurt, but the whole place stayed tense long after it ended. That moment changed something deep inside him. For the first time, he had chosen peace instead of fear. He had acted on the lessons he'd been learning for months. It wasn't about being brave, it was about being different. That night, lying in bed, he kept thinking about what had happened. He knew that moment could have gone wrong in so many ways, but it didn't. And for once, he wasn't the one causing trouble. He was helping to stop it. The next morning, a guard stopped by his cell. The warden wants to see you, he said. His stomach tightened. He wondered if he had done something wrong. When he entered the small office, the warden sat behind his desk, hands folded. He looked at him quietly for a few seconds before speaking. I heard what you did yesterday, the warden said. You could have stayed out of it, but you didn't. You tried to stop it. That took courage. He didn't know what to say. He just nodded slightly. The warden continued. We need more people like that in here. Keep doing what you're doing. Those words stayed in his mind long after he left the office. It wasn't praise that made him feel proud, it was recognition. Someone had noticed that he was changing, that he was trying to do better. Days passed, and the tension that had filled the place slowly faded. People began to look at him differently. They nodded when he walked by, spoke to him with a bit more respect. Even those who never talked much before started asking for his help or advice. He didn't think of himself as a leader, but somehow he had become one. Not because he was the loudest or the strongest, but because he stayed calm when others didn't. He continued his work in the library, but now it felt different. He wasn't just reading to escape, he was reading to grow. The older librarian noticed his focus and started giving him more responsibility. Soon he was trusted to manage book requests and help newcomers find what they needed. That trust meant more to him than anything else. One afternoon he received another letter from his mother. She had heard about his progress through one of the volunteer counselors. I always knew there was good in you, she wrote. You just needed time to see it yourself. He smiled as he read those words. He folded the letter carefully and kept it with the others, each one a reminder of how far he had come. The months rolled by, and he found himself teaching more people than ever before, helping with reading, writing, and sometimes just listening to their stories. Everyone inside carried something heavy, and sometimes all they needed was someone to understand. He wasn't perfect, but he had learned to be patient, to think before he spoke, to find calm in the middle of noise. One day, a young man approached him during lunch. He looked nervous. You really think people like us can change? He asked quietly. He looked at the young man and said, I don't think we can. I've seen it happen. That conversation stayed with him. It reminded him of the same doubts he once had and how far he'd come from that place. The prison chaplain once told him, redemption isn't about forgetting what you've done, it's about what you do next. Those words echoed in his heart every day. He started keeping track of small wins. A letter sent, a new word learned, a quiet evening without conflict. They weren't grand things, but they mattered. Then one evening, something unexpected happened. The counselor gathered everyone in the meeting room and said they were starting a new mentorship program, older inmates guiding newer ones. When she called his name as one of the mentors, he was stunned. You've earned it, she said simply. The first time he sat across from a new arrival, he didn't know where to start. But then he just told his story, about his mistakes, his anger, his change. By the end of it, the young man was listening closely, his eyes soft. Maybe I can do that too, he said. That was the moment he realized he was finally making a difference. The days started to blend into each other again, but in a softer way. He still missed his family deeply, but instead of letting that pain break him, he used it to keep going. Every letter from home felt like a small flame, lighting up the darkest corners of his heart. Sometimes, when he was alone in his cell, he thought back to the day of the argument, the day everything changed behind bars. If he had chosen to walk away, things might have stayed the same. But stepping forward that day wasn't just about stopping a fight. It was about proving to himself that he could rise above the person he once was. The respect he earned wasn't loud or forced. It came quietly, through consistency, through kindness, through the way he treated others. Even the guards, who once looked at him like every other inmate, now greeted him with small nods. Some even asked him to help calm tensions when things got rough. At night, he would sometimes sit by the window, looking at the slice of sky above the walls. The stars weren't always visible, but when they were, he'd stare for a long time. It reminded him that there was still a world out there waiting for him. A world he wanted to return to, not to escape, but to give back. He had learned that real strength wasn't in anger or power. It was in control, patience, and forgiveness. Forgiveness for others, but mostly for himself. It took him years to understand that. Now each day felt like a quiet step toward freedom. Not the kind that came from open gates, but the kind that started within. The people around him began changing too. The study group grew larger. Laughter returned in small bursts. Even in a place built to take away hope, hope found its way back in. And though he didn't say it out loud, he knew that something bigger was happening, not just to him, but to everyone who chose to believe that change was still possible. He didn't know how many more months or years he had left, but that didn't matter anymore. He had stopped waiting for freedom to start living. He was already living. One kind word, one calm choice, one new day at a time. The morning of his release came quietly. The sky outside the window was still gray when the guard knocked on his cell door and told him to get ready. He sat on his small bed for a long time, staring at the floor, unable to believe the day had finally come. For years he had imagined this moment, but now that it was here, it felt unreal. The air smelled different that morning. Even the walls seemed to whisper that his time here was over. He folded his blanket one last time and looked around the cell that had been both his punishment and his teacher. Every mark on the wall, every crack held a memory, some painful, some peaceful. He remembered the nights he cried silently, the mornings he woke up determined to change, and the countless hours he spent reading and writing letters he never sent. It was strange how a place that once felt like a cage now felt like a reminder of how far he had come. When the guard came back, he nodded and stood up. His heart was beating faster than it had in years. The heavy door opened, and the familiar sound of keys and footsteps echoed through the hallway. As he walked, other inmates called out to him. Some wished him luck, others just nodded with quiet respect. They all knew what this moment meant. It was more than freedom. It was a second chance. He walked past the cafeteria, the yard, and the library, places that had shaped his journey. The librarian who had once handed him his first book stood at the door, smiling softly. The old man lifted his hand in a silent goodbye, and he returned the gesture. It was a simple exchange, but it carried more meaning than words could express. Finally, he reached the last gate. The guard handed him a small bag with his belongings, an old watch, a few letters, and a pair of shoes. He put them on slowly, almost afraid that if he rushed, something would stop him. The last door opened with a loud click, and light spilled in from the outside. For the first time in years, he stepped into open air. The sky looked brighter than he remembered, and the wind felt like a gentle welcome. He stood still for a moment, taking it all in. The sound of cars, birds, and people laughing somewhere in the distance. It all felt so alive, so real. He took his first step out and whispered to himself, "It's over." But deep down, he knew it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter. A volunteer from a re-entry program met him outside. She smiled and offered him a ride to the halfway house where he would stay for a few weeks. The ride was silent at first. He kept looking out the window, watching people go about their normal lives. He saw kids walking to school, workers crossing the street, and families sitting at cafes. Everything looked simple yet so precious. The volunteer broke the silence and asked how he felt. He smiled faintly and said, "Like I'm learning how to breathe again." She nodded, understanding the weight behind those words. At the halfway house, he was welcomed by a small group of people, others who had been in his shoes before. They offered him food, a bed, and most importantly, kindness. That night, as he lay down on a clean bed in a quiet room, he couldn't sleep. Freedom felt strange. There were no locks clicking shut, no guards shouting, no routines controlling every move. It was peaceful but also overwhelming. The next morning, he woke up early and walked outside. The sunrise painted the sky in orange and gold. He closed his eyes and let the warmth touch his face. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel trapped by his past. He felt ready to move forward. He started small. He found a part-time job at a local repair shop, fixing things with steady hands and quiet focus. His boss, an older man with kind eyes, didn't ask too many questions about his past. He only said, "Everyone deserves a chance if they're willing to work for it." Those words stuck with him. Each day he learned something new, not just about the job, but about life outside those walls. How people hurried to catch buses, how laughter sounded in a crowded market, how it felt to earn his own money again. Every little thing carried meaning. One afternoon, as he was closing the shop, a young boy came in holding a broken bicycle. The boy looked upset, saying it was a gift from his late father. The man took the bike, studied it, and promised to fix it. He stayed late into the evening, working carefully. When the boy returned the next day and saw his bike fixed, his face lit up with joy. That simple smile reminded the man why he wanted to change in the first place. Helping someone, even in a small way, felt like healing. Weeks turned into months. He started speaking at community centers, sharing his story with young people who were struggling or on the wrong path. He never preached. He just told them the truth. How easy it was to lose yourself and how hard but possible it was to rebuild. People listened because they could feel the honesty in his voice. One day, he visited the old prison as part of a mentorship program. Walking through those gates again felt strange. The guards recognized him and greeted him warmly. He met some of the men he once shared a cell block with. They listened as he spoke about his journey, about finding peace and purpose. When he finished, one of them said, "If you can do it, maybe I can too." Those words meant everything. That night, as he sat in his small apartment, he opened a box of old letters. Among them was the one his mother had written to him years ago. Her words were still clear, full of love and hope. He wished she could see the man he had become, the one she always believed he could be. He decided to visit his hometown a few weeks later. It had changed, but in some ways it hadn't. The streets were familiar, the corner store was still there, and neighbors still greeted each other with friendly smiles. When he walked past his old house, he paused. Memories came flooding back. His childhood, his mistakes, and his promise to never waste another chance. He didn't knock on the door. Instead, he sat on a bench across the street and watched the sunset, thinking about how far he had come. He realized that freedom wasn't just about walking outside. It was about being at peace with yourself. It was about learning, forgiving, and growing. As the sky darkened, he smiled quietly. The man who once felt lost behind bars was gone. What remained was someone new, someone who understood the value of a second chance. He stood up, took a deep breath, and walked away with steady steps. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but this time he wasn't afraid. He had found strength in his pain, wisdom in his silence, and purpose in his journey. And though the walls of that prison would always be a part of his past, they no longer defined him. They had shaped him, taught him, and in a strange way set him free. That was the day everything truly changed. Not behind bars, but beyond them.